The Easterlings of RHUN are certainly one of the more evocative factions in the game and in Middle-earth in general, purely for the fact that, certainly in the movies at any rate, they appear for just a moment, and yet enough about them is gotten across in those few moments that you're interested in them. Certainly in comparison to many of the other evil men factions, they certainly have a bit of a sense of their own culture which existed long before Sauron took hold, and indeed that does ring true when you look into the lore of Middle-earth, and a lot of what RHUN have in terms of their ancestry can be traced back an awfully long way indeed, and a lot of the ins and outs of how they work as a society and how they may have fallen under the sway of Sauron and his predecessor. Some of it is more obvious, but a lot of the details are left up to the imagination, which in some ways is a little bit of a shame, because as I mentioned, they are, on the face of things, one of the more interesting forces that Middle-earth have that we don't actually know a great deal about. Many of the forces that have Númenórean heritage, we know pretty much everything about where they came from and what they do and what they prize, be they on the good or evil side of Middle-earth. But the Easterlings are different in that respect, in the sense that they have their own very clearly defined culture, in stark contrast to many of the more tribal forces that Sauron has under his sway, and yet they still choose to follow their Dark Lord for some reasons which are apparent. You know, their links to the dragons are fairly obvious, and we will see that when we have a look at some of their unit models, in particular with their scale mail. But outside of that, not so much. And also in terms of their style, that's one of the main reasons why, even though they only show up for a moment in the movies, maybe a little bit more so in the books, but their style is certainly something to behold. Certainly the peacocks of the evil faction, shall we say, with many of them choosing to forego a more aesthetically pleasing style, but RHUN do not. Meanwhile, let's get right on with talking about some of their strengths and weaknesses in the same way that we've talked about the other factions, and starting off with their strengths. The most obvious one is their armor piercing, and this is throughout the entirety of the roster, both in melee and at range. They're able to dish out a good amount of armor piercing damage, and this isn't too surprising. Given their geographic location in Middle-earth, they have had historical tussles with the Gondorians to the south and the Dalians and the Dwarves to the north, and all of these factions have in common a very strong armor throughout all of their military. So RHUN, it does behoove them really to have developed down certain paths to try and counteract this very clear strength of their most common enemies. And again, like I said, in terms of their melee force, they have got a good mix of units up close, but a lot of them have in common, even if they're not necessarily an aggressive unit, they still come with that little bit of armor piercing to help them in melee against their opposition. And it's from afar really where many forces are able to do a lot of damage, and RHUN are no different in that regard, in the sense that they have a lot of very strong armor piercing ranged units, and this is crossbows, it's javelins, it's a couple of other things as well, which we'll get onto in just a moment. But yeah, this is really the core of their identity, the fact that they're able to counteract armoured factions with a little bit more ease than even many of their fellow evil factions who do have options in this regard anyway. RHUN take that to the next level a little bit. The second thing that I would mention, however, is they're not only one-trick ponies in this regard, because they are a very versatile faction. I think RHUN, just in general, may be one of the most versatile factions in the entire game, really, because unlike many of the other evil factions that they fight alongside, they do actually have a little bit of finesse and a little bit of solidity to their roster, which isn't entirely based around having numbers and a few heavily armoured units at the centre of things. They are able to field reasonably large numbers, as many evil factions are, but they're not pigeonholed into that in the way that some of the others tend to be. They're able to perform very well in melee, they have a very good cavalry force, they have a very varied ranged force as well, good artillery, all of that sort of thing, and many varieties within these subsets as well that they're able to draw from, and in many ways that they mirror maybe a little bit more closely in this versatile manner to some of the Western kingdoms. But even then, when you consider some of the Western kingdoms, they do have a little bit of a leaning towards being a little bit more defensive, whereas RHUN are able to be defensive as well, but they're also able to be aggressive in the way that evil factions tend to be. Again, there are factions which are going to do both of those things naturally, maybe a little bit more, well, they're going to do those things well a little bit more naturally than RHUN can, but the fact that RHUN can do pretty much everything to a high standard if you build correctly is a sign of strength, really, and it just means that they're able to perform in a variety of situations. You could argue that maybe they are slightly more at home on the attack because of their armor piercing and because of the fact that they can lean a little bit more on numbers. But still, they're very good across most situations as long as you prepare for it. The third thing that I would mention as well is they have quite a lot of unique ranged weapons. They have a unique crossbow, they have a very high tier javelin. The most obvious example of this is the fact they are one of the factions in the game with a unique artillery piece in the Dragon's Breath, a very effective one as well, as we will get onto on the grassy plain, I should say. But yeah, this variety means that you're not quite sure what sort of dangerous ranged units you're going to be facing off against when you see RHUN as your opponent. There could be javelins, there could be throwing daggers, there could be crossbow bolts, there could be flaming projectiles. You know, their archers come with flaming arrows as standard. There could be rangers, there could be unique crossbows as well. All of these things are an option for RHUN, and you could say that long-range skirmishing, maybe they can be outmuscled in that regard. You know, in terms of the sheer variety of really up-close projectiles, again, there are factions which do that, you know, in a slightly more comprehensive way. But RHUN have access to all of these things, and it's up to you really what you choose to prioritise based on who you're facing off against and based on the kind of terrain you're going to be meeting them in battle on. So but having all of this, it does play a little bit into that versatility, but also the sheer number of these more unique ranged units is definitely a feather in RHUN's cap. But RHUN are not without their downsides, and the first one really goes hand in hand with the first strength that we mentioned as well, and that is that RHUN across the board tend to have lower base attack on their units, and this is the natural consequence of them having armor piercing as a real focus of theirs. It means that up close and personal, if you aren't facing off against a faction which prioritises armor highly, you know, Linden and Mirkwood are probably the best examples there, but there are others as well, amongst their own allies. For example, Harad don't have the most armor either, and it's in these situations where the lower base attack and the armor piercing focus actually will not be to your advantage as RHUN. Mirkwood are really the only ones geographically that RHUN may run into at some point where this could be a problem in, you know, if you were facing down your enemies on Middle-earth's map. But it is still a concern when you're facing off against people online in Reforged, because you can't really be sure about who they're going to face you as. And just in general as well, having a higher base attack is always going to be a good thing, because it's going to be universally useful. So RHUN choosing to have that strength, that armor piercing, comes with the natural downside of having this slightly lower base attack. The second thing that I would mention here, we kind of briefly touched on it when we mentioned their unique ranged weapons, but they have somewhat lightweight skirmishing capabilities. And this is mainly down to their archers. They have two archers, one which is fairly run-of-the-mill outside of the standard fire arrows that they come with, the other one being a ranger. None of these two are really going to be able to outmuscle factions with lots of heavy archers. Last time out we spoke about Dale, for example. They would have a relatively easy time at keeping RHUN at bay if it came down to just a sheer slugging match between archers. In those situations, RHUN will be forced to take the initiative a little bit more, which they are capable of doing, but depending on what you bring, depending on who you're facing off against, you can be forced into engagements that maybe you're not going to do so well in, purely because you're not able to establish yourself at long range with your long range skirmishers or mid range skirmishers quite as well as you would like, because even their crossbows, if you move them forwards, while you can upgrade their armor, they are still pretty squishy even by crossbow standards, and they're going to struggle to establish themselves against enemy archers who manage to get the drop on them because of their superior range. So while you can skirmish at long range, you know, that versatility is coming into it, depending on what sort of army you build for, this is an area where you will struggle against your most common foes as the Easterlings. And the final thing is something which we have mentioned a couple of times with factions that have a lot of different and varied options at the higher end of their roster, which we've already mentioned RHUN do. You can't bring everything. If you do choose to bring all of your high tier expensive units, you won't have enough of an army around them to be competitive in pretty much any environment really. So this is going to be something that you have to consider going into a game when you're building your compositions. Depending on who you're up against, you know, will determine what you want to bring. But if you do get a little bit too greedy, do try to bring too many of your high tier units, you are going to be taking away from some of the effectiveness that RHUN can have, because their mainline roster is still very potent, and you know, you can definitely bring some real strengths to bear against your opposition if you are willing to really play into that. But you know, those bodyguard tier units, we have seen it in the past where people invest too heavily into this area. You know, RHUN as well, unique artillery piece, very expensive. unique cavalry, or very high-end cavalry, very expensive, ranged units as well. Many options in this regard, and if you do, if you do get too greedy, it can be made to work against you. So you need to be careful with that. But if you manage to avoid that temptation and take into account the other two things that we've mentioned here, RHUN will serve you very, very well, I think, because of their adaptable nature and their versatility, in addition to their armor-piercing sting. But enough of this. I think now we shall take a look at RHUN on the grassy plain and see how stylish they are up close. So rather predictably perhaps, RHUN is going to have to be split across two instances of the grassy plain, although this is only because of armour upgrades to certain units, otherwise we just about would have been able to squeeze everything in. But we shall be starting off with the infantry and the archers, which is admittedly a fairly substantial amount of units, because in terms of infantry at the very least, none of them come with any sort of armour upgrades that make visual differences, so all of these units, unlike a few that we've seen in the past, are actually unique, albeit the skirmishers, there is a few duplicates there. But we shall start off with something that many an Evil Men faction does have, which is a unit of infantry that is reasonably cheap, or very cheap in comparison to some others, and a little bit more numerous and a little bit more designed around swarm tactics, and this is the Carmel's Immortals, which are a rather interesting kind of unit because they run contrary to what many of this kind of unit anyway is designed to do, which is effectively to just die without being too effective, just about absorbing punishment. But the Carmel's Immortals are not entirely designed around that mentality, purely because they don't come equipped with a shield, which means they're going to be not quite as good at doing that particular job in the first place, and also there are a few less of them than some of the really numerous units that you will see from other factions like Haradrim Spearmen, Dunlending Clansmen and the like. And in that sense as well, a lot of this kind of unit tends to be a spear unit, so that they can also be used to just get in the way of cavalry and do a bit of damage, even though many of them may die anyway. The Carmel's Immortals may be set up to be cheap and still numerous in comparison to many other infantry units, but they are meant to be reasonably effective for their cost in melee. I mean, the attack of 6 is okay for the cost, it's not amazing, but where they do stand out a little bit more is the fact that they are a dual-wielding unit, which means their defensive skill is going to be better than other units of this cost anyway. As soon as you start getting into more genuine infantry units, regular line infantry on upwards, then the Carmel's Immortals will be pretty much entirely reliant on their numbers to be truly effective in that kind of engagement. But their armour is also not terrible for a unit of this cost either. 7 is decent, although the lack of a shield does mean that any sort of archer outside of the very, very basic stuff is still going to be able to do damage pretty quickly to them. But it is an interesting trade-off, because it means that if you can force those melee engagements, then they are going to be better than the equivalents from other factions, but if you can't, if you are kept at arm's length, then they could be less effective than those units that are even cheaper than them. But it's an interesting trade-off, and it does give RHUN another option in melee, because it means that if you can get that melee engagement set up in conjunction with some of their other mainline units, they can make for a very effective fighting force indeed. And it is in these units where RHUN really do gain their identity, their standard rank and file, starting off of course with the Loka Flagrim, which are probably the most significant unit in the runic roster in many ways, because many a force has got a unit of halberdiers, heavy spears, and other such supporting units. But the Flagrim do stand apart because they are RHUN's standard line infantry unit, but they do come equipped with that armour-piercing damage, the axes and maces that they do wield. They've got a very distinctive style as well, of course. The runic style has been one that has remained unchanged ever since vanilla, and I think that will remain the case forevermore, because they really did go the extra mile way back in vanilla Third Age when they made the runic unit models. They always seem to be higher res than many of the others, and it's only now that many of the other factions have actually been able to catch up to them about a decade later, so that does go to show where the priorities lay in those early days. But outside of their style as well, the Flagrim, in comparison to other units of this type, a little bit more expensive at their base, although many of the Western Kingdoms, when they do fully upgrade their armour, do actually, either equal or even exceed the cost of the Flagrim. The attack, as we mentioned, 6 is about on par with some of the more defensively minded units of line infantry from elsewhere, but they do come with that armour piercing anyway, so that does offset that a bit. The total defence scores as well, the armour score is very good at its base. I mean, 10 is among the higher levels from the Western Kingdoms as well, but you do pay for that at the outset. 183 men in the unit, so a few, like the Gondorians and the Arthurdanians, do have more men per unit, but individually speaking, you can certainly make the case that the armor piercing makes the Flagrim at least situationally more effective and damaging. Nice shield value. Defensive skill is not particularly high though, which again, that is another downside to many an armor piercing unit. They not only lose out a little bit in terms of their baseline attack score, but also a little bit in terms of their defensive skill as well. So if you aren't in an engagement where you can leverage that armor piercing, the Flagrim are going to be less effective than their equivalent counterparts from many other factions. But if you are, then it does give them that little bit of a boost. Moving on, the Polearm unit that RHUN have, as we mentioned when we were talking about Dale, very few factions have pikes and halberds, but RHUN were a faction that always only had halberdiers anyway. The Loka Gamprim 650 is very reasonable actually for the kind of unit that they are. The halberdier, which will give you that anchor and extra armor piercing, of course. 163 is fairly standard fare for basic phalanx units when it comes to this sort of thing. Obviously the bonus fighting cavalry is nice. It means that the centre of your line is very rarely just going to be mowed down by enemy units on horseback, and I mean statistically it's a little bit difficult to draw conclusions. Halberdiers tend to have slightly better baseline stats than pikes anyway, but this is a decent spread for a unit that has a phalanx formation and isn't overly expensive either. Nice attack score of 8, boosted by that armor piercing of course, but it's the defensive scores where polearm units can differentiate themselves from one another. Decent armor score. Defensive skill is obviously quite poor, so when the formation gets broken you are in a bit of trouble, but a nice little shield value as well. 3 is not super significant, but it is enough to the point where they do at least have something going for them if they do get isolated and enemy skirmishers start trying to pick them off. Many a polearm unit after all does not have that, and in conjunction with the armor that is perfectly serviceable indeed. Now, the centerpiece of any sort of defensive effort from RHUN is going to be the Loka Scion Rim. This is a jump up in terms of cost to 800, and it is also, well, effectiveness against armour is here as well actually. That was something that has been added. The bonus against cavalry as well is nice, but it is the defensive stats really of the Scion Rim that has always set them apart from the other units that RHUN have on the front line, and that's where the extra cost really does come from. Also the fact that the inspiration effect now works in this version of the game and the Scion Rim have that is going to be useful, because RHUN, while they are slightly better off than a few of the other Evil Men factions, and certainly from some of the other Orc factions in terms of their discipline, it's certainly not a limitless morale pool that they have. And if you do go more numbers heavy, then a unit like this to help inspire stuff like your Carmel's Immortals and some of your lower end skirmishers is still going to be necessary. As we mentioned, I mean the attack score is actually pretty good for a spear unit, but again still subject to the spear malus, and it is an expensive unit as well, so if you are paying this amount of money for a unit like this, you do want them to be able to dish out some kind of damage to enemy units. And then of course the defensive values as well. The armor score jumps up an extra tick from the Flagrim to 11, which is significant because it just makes them a little bit more bulky. The defensive skill is also, you know, not dreadful for a unit of spears, and then the shield value is nice as well. So being that really solid unit of spears, which is not too untypical for or atypical for some evil factions. I mean, the Guards of Orthanc form a similar role for Isengard, the Morgul Chosen do for Mordor, these heavy spears that sit at the centre of your line and act as the beacon around which you can build the rest of your infantry force. More defensive, but not overly so. I actually didn't even know they had the effectiveness against armour now, so that is an interesting and significant thing actually, because it really does bring them into line with some of the better spears from other factions. Even stuff like Numenor now have another unit to contend with on a similar level to themselves. Another armor piercing tool that RHUN have is something which other factions are going to, you know, not be too estranged from either, and that is a two-hander shock infantry unit that comes with armor piercing, effectively an axe, but in many ways, well, this is really just the same halberdier or halberd that the Gamprim wield, only the Shadow Guard wield it more aggressively. The Carmel Shadow Guard, very aggressive as far as a unit goes. They can hide anywhere, which is good because their armor score is also reasonably low. The Carmel's units don't pack on the armor quite so much, but they are far more damage orientated, so there is a bit more risk to using them, but they do offer that extra bit of punch as well. Bonus fighting cavalry, again, they do wield halberds at the end of the day, so while they may not have the phalanx formation, if cavalry gets caught in and amongst them, they will do a lot of damage to them. Fear effect is always nice. If you can land that charge, it can help start that cascading failure among your opponent's line. 15 attack and 15 charge bonus will only help with that. That's big damage. As we mentioned, low armor score. The defensive skill is decent though. The Carmel's units do lean on that a little bit more. I mean, it's rare that an armor-piercing shock infantry unit prioritises defensive skill, but as we mentioned, no armor and also no shields means that if they do get isolated by enemy archers, they will get ripped up pretty quickly. 750 is not too expensive, but expensive enough to the point where you do want to safeguard them from that as well. But the ability to hide is one of their main benefits when it comes to doing that. And then I was thinking about putting these guys on their own tier. To be fair, 825 is the most expensive unit on this level. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are the runic assassins, assassin class units. I mean, not every faction has access to them, but as we mentioned, RHUN have got access to many a good ranged unit, and the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are a good hybridized example of that. Chanting is an interesting one. It's kind of a weird one to quantify because it's very hard to see in replays or in a real battle situation how useful it's actually being, but the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen can do it. They can hide anywhere as well, which is good because this is the kind of unit with its damage potential and also the difficulty killing them in melee, honestly, that enemy archers will want to try and focus them down if they can. Effectiveness against armor with those throwing daggers of theirs. They also cause fear, which is nice. Again, it's another one of those units where you can try and twist the knife a little bit. And when you have a look at some of their stats, I mean, the missile attack of 10, that's their throwing daggers. But in melee, also very effective as well. Not so much in terms of being a bulky sort of line unit. Their armor score is okay, but not amazing. They have no shield and it's only 1 hit point. But everywhere else, really good melee attack at 18, and also the defensive skill of 20. I've said it several times in the past, but it is the sort of value that the elves would not be ashamed to have in some of their higher end units as well. But 825 is a decently high value, and assassin units are always a little bit fiddly to use. Something which is perhaps a little bit more by the book, really, in terms of the rest of RHUN's roster, is going to be the Carmel's Chosen, and in many ways they're a fairly simplistic unit of sword and shield bodyguard. They don't have the armor piercing that much of the rest of the runic line tends to have, and they don't have like a two-hander or anything like that. They are more defensively orientated. They do have the inspiration and the fear effect, which again just bolsters your own troops whilst harming the enemies, which is nice. And in terms of their own stats line, there are stronger units of sword and board infantry, but not too many, honestly. The attack score of 15 is honestly quite nice as well in comparison to some others, but again, as a bodyguard unit, you're paying an awful lot. 1200, again, is not the most expensive unit, but it's certainly getting up there. But it's the defensive values where the Carmel's Chosen obviously shine a bit more. That second hit point is nice. The shield value the same as the units in front of them, but in conjunction with a significantly high defensive skill and also an armor value of 11. This is going to be by far your most resilient unit in melee, as it should be. And yeah, also, just on a personal note, one of my personally favourite looking units of infantry in the game now, the sort of sun effect on their helms and the gold sort of trim on the silver scales and such. A very good unit, and also a nice progression of using the original models for RHUN and then making a new bodyguard unit out of them. I think a significant improvement from what they were last time out, and they weren't a bad looking unit in the first place. Now then, the ranged units, of which RHUN have got plenty of options as well, the dedicated ranged units at any rate. No evil faction would really be truly complete without a unit of basic javelins that they can use to play cat and mouse with the enemy in a siege, do a bit of damage quickly for a relatively small outlay, and the Balkoth tribesmen are that for RHUN. Bonus fighting cavalry, effectiveness against armour. The stats in melee are obviously very poor, although they do have access to an armour upgrade, which, to be fair, only bolsters the armour from 3 to 4, but considering this is the kind of unit that enemy defenders may very well want to try and knock down a peg or two with their own archers quickly, that armour upgrade can make the difference between that being an effective tactic and not. The missile attack of 6 is fairly typical for a unit at this tier as well. Don't really want to be getting involved with them in melee too early on. The shield is nice, again, just to help safeguard them from enemy defending archers and the like. But yeah, in melee, they're very much going to be the sort of thing where you commit them forwards when they're out of ammunition for their numbers alone, just to try and help overwhelm the enemy. A melee attack of 6 is not terrible for a unit of this kind, but their defensive stats, the armour of 4 and defensive skill of 1, means that units with anything about them at all are going to carve through them in melee pretty quickly, but it's very similar to the likes of the River Patrol that we've seen before in Dale. Moving on to their Mainline Archer unit. If you do get involved in a skirmishing fight, it's almost certainly going to be with the Gnar Rim at the centre. I did mention they're a little bit more lightweight in terms of their ability to go back and forth with enemy heavy archers than you may like, but again, this is one of the minor drawbacks to them, because they do have their upsides. I mean, the missile attack is 6, which is typical for this kind of human archer, the mainline unit. 600 is not too expensive. Again, their defense, armor not terrible, but can't be upgraded. And also you can't bring them in the kind of numbers that would allow you to overwhelm the enemy too easily. Their melee abilities are pretty limited as well, honestly. Again, for the numbers you would commit them in late on, much like the tribesmen we just mentioned, but the thing that does set them apart is the fact that they come with fire arrows as standard, which does mean that you do have, in a similar way to poison projectiles, you're going to be able to do a little bit of damage to the enemy's morale just latently without having to use flaming projectiles necessarily, which is nice. I don't know if that's working or not, in all fairness. That is a caveat. But yeah, it's also nice, a nice visual effect anyway. But I think, perhaps, as is the case with most factions that have them at all, the crossbows are going to be your more significant skirmisher, especially in sieges, purely because of their ability to deal damage over sort of medium lengths of time. The stopping power of crossbows remains a real issue when you're in a siege battle, whether you're having to attack into them or whether you're having to prevent the attackers from using them. The E-Strong crossbows, in all fairness, are probably easier to deal with than some, because especially here when they don't have an armor upgrade, they are pretty squishy. You can upgrade the armor not once but twice, so here they gain access to the helms and some slightly better chest armor, and here they start to take on the same sort of appearance as the RHUN and the other Loka units in melee, which does boost the armor to 7, but it does also make them a pretty expensive unit for something that you will then need to use well. The bolts will need to find their marks, because ultimately if committing them in melee, even with upgraded armor, their stats are poor, so you are going to need that 10 missile damage to be used effectively against pretty much all of your foes, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, crossbows, they're not the most glass cannon-y crossbow in the game. That title does go to the Umbar example, but they do come a close second, and the only reason they're not is because they can upgrade their armor, so that is something to bear in mind, but ever the useful tool to use on the field. And then moving on, as is the case with many a faction, they have access to a ranger, the Carmel Shadow Bows, and they come with all of the strengths and weaknesses that pretty much every ranger in the game comes with. 8 missile damage, as is the case with human rangers, which is enough to do the damage. You know, good range on them as well. And when it comes down to melee as well, their defensive skill is high enough to the point where they are going to be difficult to finish off. So if they're your last unit left and your enemy is battered and bruised and doesn't have much left, your defensive skill could be enough to see you over the edge. But realistically speaking, it's going to be that missile damage that you're going to want to deploy to good effect. They can hide anywhere, of course, like any good ranger unit can, but they're the only other unit of archers that you have in addition to the RHUN, and that plays into the fact that skirmishing back and forth over long periods of time, because of the slightly more lightweight nature of your archers, isn't necessarily RHUN's strong point, so do be careful with that. Now, specialty crossbows in the Dragon's Wrath crossbows. 1000, I mean, they're not technically a bodyguard unit anymore, but that does mean they've had their unit size increased. They can inspire troops, they can use sharpened stakes, of course they're effective against armor. Even though they're not technically a bodyguard unit anymore because of the lack of a second hit point, they're still very good in melee. Melee attack of 19 and all of the good defensive abilities as well. 16 defensive skill, armor score of 11. I mean, these are the stats of a bodyguard unit, except for that second hit point. But there are also more of them, so late on you may want those extra numbers anyway. Missile attack of 14, obviously heavy crossbows. I mean, the damage they can dish out is extreme, but you do need to get them into the right position, and the margin for error with them is slightly finer than it would be with the standard E-Strons, because the E-Strons are simply cheaper. When you pay this much for a unit, you really do need them to be effective, and as good as they are in melee, they're not going to be able to get all of their value with their two-handed waved sword. So yeah, I mean, impressive though as far as stats go. And the final ranged unit they have is a unit of high-end javelins, not quite bodyguard. Well, I mean, second hit point, I mean, technically they are perhaps the most similar unit to the Balkoth Sapphire Bladesmen here is probably the Reforged Javelins from Rudour, casting our mind back to them. I mean, once again, they can hide anywhere, which is nice, because as much as they do have a second hit point and a small shield value, enemy archers, especially high-end ones, are going to want to try and knock them over pretty quickly because their armor score is very, very low at 4. But everything else about them is very, very impressive. They have that very high missile attack of 10 with those javelins, and in melee, very good stats indeed. The defensive skill of 14 is very, very good. I believe they're armor piercing in melee as well with those two-handed falxes. But, you know, the melee attack and the charge bonus as well, 25 melee attack is big. So as long as you don't get them exposed too much to enemy skirmishes and the like, and you don't get them, you know, isolated and surrounded so their defensive skill starts to fall apart, they can be very, very good at what they do. And again, it's just another feather in the runic cap of all of their ranged units because of all of these, you know, options that they have. There's a lot of options. You can't really do everything, as we mentioned with RHUN, but you do have the ability to form up some pretty decent compositions. But now we'll finish RHUN's roster off by having a look at their cavalry selection and their artillery, both of which also come with some goodies. So not a limitless cavalry force by any means, but there's enough here for you to certainly build, especially in terms of shock value, a good cavalry force. And in many ways, actually, we will start off here with the Inas Rim. The standard lancers from many a faction, I mean, they are slightly more expensive perhaps than them, usually, you know, about 700 to 750. 800 is not a huge step up. But the main difference with the runic cavalry overall, you can see the cataphract nature of them with the heavy armour and barding, and just in general the bulkier aesthetic. And that should tell you really where the runic priorities lie. The defensive abilities of these cavalry units are going to be higher, you know, especially in terms of the armour. The defensive skill maybe not quite so much. So if the Inas Rim, because they are standard lancers, do get caught out by melee cavalry or knights or that sort of thing, they are going to be in trouble. The shield value will help them though against enemy archers who try to zone them out. They aren't going to have the ability to really punch through that armour too much. Standard charge bonus of 15, which, as we mentioned, only a few units really go above that. Specialty units go above that in terms of your rank and file cavalry, and the Inas Rim certainly prioritise defence in that regard, which over the long haul in a battle could be the more useful thing. And also the Inas Rim have been around ever since Vanilla Third Age as well, and once upon a time they were actually the highest tier of runic cavalry rather than the more basic variant that we see here. But nowadays we do have a bulkier version of them, and that is the Dragon's Wrath Warlords. 1200, which again is fairly standard fare for a unit of bodyguard lancers. They're not knights, so they don't have the ability to, or the effectiveness against other cavalry units, so much in the same vein as the likes of the Gondorians or Cardlan. Of course, now people have started to plaster me with messages, how typical. But yeah, the inspiration of nearby troops, as we've mentioned with cavalry, maybe not quite as important, but the fear effect most certainly is. Nice effectiveness against armour, but of course here as well, I mean, the attack and the charge scores are the same, only actually less effective than the Inas Rim, at least initially, because there are fewer of them. They will last far longer, however, because their defensive stats are significantly higher. Armour about the same, but the defensive skill higher, shield, and of course that second hit point means they technically have to be killed twice, so if you look after them, they will certainly last a long time on the field. But if you do want to go the extra mile, then the Carmel's Dragon Knights are going to be the way to go. And in terms of defensive knights, or defensive lance knights, I mean, they're kind of similar. They've always been sort of the evil counterpart, really, to the Arthurdane mounted knights of Anuminas, in the sense that they do really prioritise how defensively able they are. Again, you know, the cataphract style nature of the runic cavalry should make that apparent. Again, thick armour, good defensive skill, second hit point and a shield. 1500 is fairly typical for this kind of unit, although some do stray a little bit over that. Again, inspiration and fear, charge bonus of 20. Just in general though, the effectiveness against cavalry means, and then this is the only unit that you have as RHUN, which is going to be a cavalry unit that will fight evenly with other high-end cavalry units. So if you do want to go the cavalry route, then the Dragon Knights are not a must, but certainly something that you would heavily recommend, I would suggest, just because they're the only ones that will allow you to do that. And in conjunction with the other units, you can outmuscle many a cavalry force you oppose, but do take care, because you don't have a huge amount of anti-cavalry tools on horseback, but anti-infantry in your lancers is certainly there, and also in your Wain Riders of RHUN. Chariots we've seen before, a little bit more organised, the runic ones. Again, 81 of them. Probably my least favourite chariot unit, honestly, because, again, they have archers as their ranged attack, which is the least effective of the bunch. But that is also the least consequential part of these chariot units in the first place. In many ways, all of them will do the same job, which is to really mess up an opponent's infantry force, cause a load of chaos before inevitably falling by the wayside. Chariots are pretty much the ultimate flash-in-the-pan style unit, and all of them are going to have a similar sort of thing said about them. 3 hit points. All of the stats that you see here outside of the missile attack, which is a little bit different, are really what Chariots need to be in order to be effective but not overpowered. If you gave them more hit points and more defensive ability, they would simply be unstoppable. And if you gave them less, they would vaporize instantly on contact with most forces. So again, it's all about keeping them moving, very micro-intensive, but also in the right sort of situation, they can really help turn the tide of a battle or just give you the momentum and allow you to go forth and sweep your opponent off the field. 1250 is a big investment for that though, so you need to be prepared to use it well. And finally, something which has been effective in many a battle that we've seen in this version of the game, the unique runic artillery, which is the Dragon's Breath, probably the most striking piece of artillery in the game, honestly. A reskinned variant of the Great Bombard from vanilla Medieval 2, and it's not quite the same as that. In many ways it functions fairly similarly to a ballista in the sense that it's a fairly straight arcing shot. It's probably got higher damage potential than even the unique ballistas outside of maybe the Isengard one, but I would say even then the Dragon's Breath probably can outperform it given ideal circumstances. And yeah, really, really damaging. It does have a bouncing projectile as well, so there's a bit of unpredictability and a bit of extra damage potential as well, maybe in the same way that a trebuchet's projectile now bounces. 1500 does make it, I believe, the most expensive artillery piece in the game, but based on what we've seen of this new version of the game, it has been the most reliable artillery piece, even more so than Isengard's ballista, which always used to hold that crown. I mean, it's one of the two, I would say, just because the damage potential on both is so high, and there's a little bit more of an ease of use. I mean, the one downside you would say is it's so big as an artillery piece that even now artillery needs several hits in order to go down. All opposition artillery is going to be able to hit the Dragon's Breath because of how big they are. So the model size is actually something that works against them in that regard. The crew themselves as well is unique, and it's kind of like a version of the Dragon's Wrath Guildsman that don't have a ranged attack and are even a little bit bulkier, I think, with their armour and their defensive skill scores, and also the second hit point. So they're a very interesting crew. I mean, they are effectively a slightly... like, they're not as good as regular bodyguard units, I don't think. I mean, their stats are fine. Like, it's hard to tell without the attack score, honestly, but it is effectively like having a bodyguard infantry unit and an artillery piece, which is probably one of the reasons why it's so popular, because it is such an effective artillery piece, and ultimately, even if it does nothing, you're just overpaying a little bit for a bodyguard unit, so there is that as well. So, that was RHUN as a faction. They have something for everyone, I think. If you were to blind pick a faction to go into battle against someone else with, I think RHUN is probably one of the first ones you should consider, because they can do pretty much everything to an adequate level. Again, every faction does some things better than others, but RHUN are one of those that don't have a really obvious blind spot, I would say. And also, I think they're one of the better looking factions in the game. I think the Easterlings have got that sense of style down very, very well, especially among the evil factions, who many of them fall a little bit short of the forces of good in that regard, but RHUN certainly do not. They've managed to keep up their appearances. So, as far as what we're going to do next, I think we will start to make our way westward again, and we will, the first stop on the way westward is to have a look at a faction which again is lesser known perhaps, and we'll take a look at the Vale of Dorwinion. So I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for that.